In 238 BC, King Kaoli of Chu was buried inside a tomb with 9 underground chambers. 15 years later, his kingdom was destroyed by Qin. The people who built the tomb couldn't have known the exact countdown, but they knew Chu was under pressure. The capital had already moved east, away from Qin's advance. Even so, the palace commissioned one of the largest and most complex tombs ever built for a Chu king. In the next few minutes, we're going inside that tomb. We'll see how it was organized, how archaeologists worked out who was buried there, and why a kingdom on the edge of collapse still built like this. The site is called Wuwangdun, near modern Huainan in China's Anhui province. This wasn't a single grave cut into the earth. It was an entire royal cemetery, a main tomb, surrounding ditches, chariot and horse pits, sacrificial pits, smaller burials, and a massive burial mound. The dead king wasn't given a coffin, he was given a landscape. Then archaeologists reached the main burial pit. It measured about 51 meters across and nearly 20 meters deep, roughly the depth of a 6-story building. 21 step levels descended toward the wooden chambers at the bottom. Standing at the edge, a person would have looked tiny. And the surface was only the beginning. A long sloping passage led down into the tomb. At the bottom stood a huge wooden burial structure built from massive timbers. Its layout looked less like a grave and more like a building placed underground. At the center was the king's coffin chamber. Around it, 8 side rooms. 9 spaces in total, and none of them filled at random. Each had a job. Some held ritual bronzes. Others held lacquerware, jade, weapons, musical instruments, objects tied to court ceremony. Ink writing on the wooden covers even marked out the order and function of each chamber, like a floor plan left behind on purpose. This was an organized version of royal life, rebuilt underground. The king stayed at the center, while the music, the ritual, the attendants who'd once surrounded him were recreated around him in death. One of the clearest examples came from 2 wooden figure pits. Together, they held more than 280 wooden figures, some appearing to represent a ceremonial escort, others linked to court music and dance. Instead of burying hundreds of living attendants, the tomb recreated them in wood. The effect was still powerful. The king entered the afterlife with a silent court waiting below ground. The instruments were just as striking. Archaeologists found more than 50 times an ancient Chinese zither, some over 2 meters long, among the largest ever excavated in China. Then there was the bronze times ding, a ceremonial vessel measuring 88.9 centimeters across, wider than the famous Zhuke ding. The piece long considered Anhui Museum's prized possession. These weren't just expensive objects. Their scale was the point. Chu was under growing military pressure, and its workshops could still produce vessels this size, instruments this large, an underground court this precisely arranged. So here's the question we're sitting with. Why would a kingdom that's losing spend this much on a dead man's palace? Hold on to that. First, we need to know who this dead man actually was. At first, all archaeologists knew was that this belonged to someone at the top of late Chu society. The scale, the layout, the ritual objects all pointed to royalty. But several Chu kings lived out the kingdom's final decades. A huge tomb doesn't come with a name attached. The identification came from several kinds of evidence stacked together. The age of the tomb, inscriptions found on bronze vessels, the rank of the burial goods, the layout of the cemetery, the historical geography of the region. Eventually, all of it pointed to the same man, King Kaoli of Chu, personal name Zhong Yuan. That single conclusion changed the meaning of everything else in the ground. This wasn't the tomb of some unknown ruler. It belonged to the king who governed Chu during its final fight against Qin. And that's where the earlier question gets its answer. Chu had once controlled vast territory with its own court traditions, music, art, political identity. But by the late 3rd century BC, Qin had become the strongest military power in China. In 241 BC, Chu moved its capital east to the region around Shouchun, near Wuwangdun, putting distance between the throne and Qin's pressure in the west. 3 years later, King Kaoli died. His tomb doesn't read like the burial of a kingdom that had already given up. The ritual system was still precise. Bronze vessels appeared in formal sets. The instruments recreated the sound of the court. Hundreds of wooden figures stood in for the attendants and performers. Chu was losing ground on the map, but underground, its ruling house was still performing power at the largest possible scale, as if nothing had changed. Then came the real countdown. King Kaoli died in 238 BC. In 223 BC, Qin armies defeated Chu. 2 years after that, the ruler of Qin finished conquering the last rival states and became China's first emperor. But we should be careful with the phrase 15 years left. The people who buried King Kaoli didn't know the exact date Chu would fall. They weren't sealing a time capsule for a kingdom they knew was doomed. That countdown only exists for us, looking back. What they did know was that Qin was dangerous. The balance of power was shifting, and the capital had already been moved once. And still, the crown poured enormous labor and resources into preserving its identity underground. That doesn't mean the tomb caused Chu's defeat, or that King Kaoli wasted the kingdom's strength, or that its rulers had given up on the living world. What it shows is something more specific. Even mid-crisis, the court kept protecting the things that made Chu times the rituals, the music, the lacquer, the spatial order, the king at the center of it all. When Qin conquered Chu, it erased the kingdom from the political map, but Wuwangdun preserved a version of that world conquest couldn't touch. That's why this tomb matters beyond its size. Because it was excavated scientifically, archaeologists didn't just recover objects, they recorded exactly where each one stood, which room it belonged to, how the whole system fit together. A bronze vessel in a museum case can tell you how it was made. The same vessel still sitting in its original chamber can tell you what it was times for. That difference turns treasure into evidence. Wuwangdun doesn't show us a kingdom already dead. It shows us one still expressing order, confidence, and identity, while the ground underneath it was shifting. Qin erased Chu from the map, but below it, the royal world King Kaoli built stayed exactly as he left it for more than 2,000 years. He had 15 years between his burial and the fall of his kingdom. His tomb outlasted it by more than 2,000.